But is it absurd to assume that in a world of male privilege, men use a variety of means, including violence, to maintain this position? If men use violence to resolve the crisis that is inherent in the gulf between the power that they expect and the powerlessness that they experience, then this is as much about their expectation and entitlement as about their experience. Entitlement is another way to read the Columbine school killings. It is important to deconstruct not simply the norms of a violent masculinity, but the expectations of white male privilege in a sexist and racist society, such that the young killers felt entitled to take up guns and act out their anger and frustration within one of the institutions most central to their community. The sense of crisis this event provoked is in marked contrast to the silence of the white mainstream that surrounds the high rates of gun violence and gun death among youth of color in the USA. Once again, it is young men doing the killing, but rarely is a masculinity crisis invoked to account for their behavior. Theirs is the violence of the other, the violence of gangs and the ghetto, a daily statistic to be ignored. But when young white men go on a killing spree, gender is called upon to explain this threat to society, this cultural dysfunction to be corrected. Columbine is not only a reminder of what white men will do when they feel denied their privilege in a sexist and racist society, but also what the discourse of masculinity does to mask the workings of male power and privilege and the functions of violence to maintain it. This absence of analysis of power and privilege is central to the framing of men's violence in terms of an unachievable masculinity. There are echoes here of the sex role strain thesis, popular in the 1970s, in which the problems of men can be attributed to the difficulty, if not impossibility, of living up to the role prescribed for their sex. Apart from the difficulty of finding much evidence, historical or cross-cultural, that most men are in a state of abjection, unable to live up to their sex role, or in its updated version, gender role, it's important to note the conservative politics at the heart of an unachievable masculinity thesis. It draws on the feminist critique of the impression that women suffer under the tyranny of social constructions of femininity to try and tell a parallel story about the ways that men suffer from masculinity. Keene's commentary on the moral panic generated around young men's use of anabolic steroids is useful here. As she points out, the literalness of artificial testosterone as the substitute for an absent or non-functioning maleness makes steroid use a particularly compelling sign of wounded masculinity. Keene reports on the identification of an Adonis complex among young men whose concern about their lack of muscularity is paralleled with eating disorders among young women. But as Keene notes, this false equivalence does not take into account the very different histories of representations of male and female bodies and the specific meanings attached to female and male body ideals, and I would add the material interests of men's domination of women that are served by these different meanings and representations. Significantly, the cure for the Adonis complex was identified as being dependent on a conservative commitment to a recuperation of a genuine and secure masculinity based on substance rather than appearance. There is a conservative politics to be found in the thesis of frustrated masculinity too. As a number of commentators have noted, the frustrations are far from evenly distributed and are heavily determined by men's other experiences of oppression, whether it be racism or economic exploitation. Hartfield is clear that the discourse of masculinity crisis and male violence is being used to pathologize and pacify anger about and resistance to class oppression. As he writes, masculinity theories do appear to be telling us something about a loss of power, but it's wrong to see this loss of power as a loss of power in relation to women. Rather, it is in relation to capital. The crisis is not one of masculinity, but of one of the working class. As Lynn Siegel writes in the UK, there was a time, it seems to me, when feminists would not so readily have lost sight of the significance of class oppression for the sake of identifying a universal male beastliness. The conservative politics lurking around these explanations of men's violence give a clue as to the real crisis, the crisis in patriarchy. In the US context with which I'm most familiar, one can read the last 30 years of US political cultural life as in part this effort to recuperate a secure masculinity from the crisis in white patriarchal authority provoked by the gains of the women's, gay, and civil rights movements. But Robinson warns us against sneering simply at the white male victim as the latest ruse of a white patriarchy under attack. It is more complicated than that. For announcements of a crisis in white masculinity in the USA are about a recentering of that which has been decentered by feminism, gay liberation, and black power. This is a crisis of visibility, of becoming marked as gendered and racialized subjects and no longer the abstract universal of invisible privilege. Robinson offers a subtle account of the ambiguity of this visibility for previously unmarked men in contemporary US culture, that the only way to be seen is to be seen as a victim. In an age of identity politics, and other commentators noted, if the ultimate legitimizing move is the claim to oppression, then it's unsurprising that men will seek the cultural capital that comes with the charge of having been oppressed. We've arrived at an identity politics of the dominant, which continues to have important implications for public policy on men's violence. In exploring these implications, I want to stay focused on two realities: that it remains true that men do most of the violence in the world, and that addressing this violence involves understanding, in the words of researcher and activist Judith Herman, the commonalities between rape survivors and combat veterans, between battered women and political prisoners, between the survivors of vast concentration camps created by tyrants who rule nations, and the survivors of small hidden concentration camps created by tyrants who rule their homes. The question that I grapple with is how to hold the complexity of the personal, political, individual, structural realities of men's violence, and what such realities mean and make possible for men's roles and responsibilities in resisting such violence. There is no question that masculinity discourse makes room for more complex discussion of and response to the relationship between men and violence. In putting men back into gender, it has moved us beyond simplistic binaries that equate men with violence and aggression, women with peace. After all, not all violence is men's, and not all men are violent. But there are a number of problems in the way that masculinity as an identity politics of the dominant frames men's violence. Such a discourse privileges the emotional over the material. This is not to deny the critical importance of the emotional work that is needed with men that Vic Seidler described in his opening plenary. I firmly believe in the importance of this work, and I'm committed to it in my own life and work. I'm a founder and member of a men's group that looks specifically at the emotional costs and challenges of men's gender training. And we also talk about the material privileges we gain within a male supremacist society such as the USA. Without this focus on the material and